A bank employee humiliated Michelle Obama and kicked her out, but regretted it when Barack Obama arrived. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching from. The marble floors of Manhattan's most exclusive financial institution gleamed under the glow of chandeliers imported from Italy. The towering glass windows framed the bustling streets outside, where black SUVs and yellow taxis crawled past designer boutiques and five-star restaurants. Inside the bank, the atmosphere hummed with quiet affluence. Clients dressed in tailored suits and silk scarves spoke in hushed tones, their conversations laced with phrases about investment portfolios and property acquisitions. Jessica Reed, a junior teller, smoothed the sleeves of her navy blazer and double-checked the placement of her name tag. It was her third month working at Whitman and Pierce Private Banking, and she had already learned that appearances mattered as much as precision. She had been warned by her manager, Steve Mallory, that one misstep, one transaction handled improperly, or a moment of hesitation could spell disaster. Jessica adjusted her posture behind the marble counter and took a deep breath. Her reflection in the glass partition showed a young black woman with dark, tightly coiled hair pulled back into a neat bun. She'd chosen small pearl earrings that morning, hoping they would give her an air of understated professionalism. Despite her outward calm, her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the stack of transaction slips. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Jessica's eyes flicked to the framed photo she kept hidden in the corner of her workstation. Her two younger brothers, Terrence and Miles, beaming from the stands of a Little League game. After their parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, she had taken on the role of provider and protector. Terrence needed new soccer cleats. Miles had asthma and relied on expensive medication that her insurance barely covered. This job wasn't just a paycheck. It was a lifeline. "Jessica, focus." She muttered the words under her breath as the line of clients shifted forward. "Good morning, Mr. Davenport," she said, flashing a practiced smile at the elderly man in front of her. "Morning, young lady," he replied, setting a leather-bound checkbook on the counter. "Just the usual transfer to my retirement fund." As she processed the transaction, Jessica's thoughts wandered to the new security protocols that had been rolled out earlier that week. They were strict, no exceptions. Every client, regardless of their status or familiarity, had to provide up-to-date identification for large transactions or access to safety deposit boxes. Even minor discrepancies could trigger alerts. Steve had drilled it into her during training. "You're here to enforce the rules, not bend them," he'd said. "If someone pushes back, you push harder. I don't care if it's the mayor himself, understand?" Jessica had nodded at the time, but now the weight of those words felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just the protocols that made her nervous. It was the way clients looked at her. Most days, she could ignore the condescension, the way some people hesitated before handing over their IDs as if they didn't trust her to handle them. Other times, it was harder to shake. She was still replaying one of those moments from last week. An older woman had looked Jessica up and down and asked if she was filling in for someone more experienced. When the glass doors at the front of the bank swung open, Jessica turned, her trained smile already in place, but it faltered when she saw who had entered. Michelle Obama. The former First Lady stepped into the bank with the kind of effortless elegance that made everyone else seem overdressed. She wore a fitted navy blazer over a cream blouse, tailored pants, and heels that clicked softly against the marble. A pair of oversized sunglasses perched atop her head, pushing back sleek, shoulder-length hair. The air shifted. Conversations tapered off as people turned to watch her. Jessica's breath caught. She had never met Michelle Obama, but she had idolized her for years. Her speeches, her books, her work advocating for education and nutrition programs, Michelle was more than a celebrity. She was a role model, a symbol of resilience and grace. And now she was standing in Jessica's bank. Jessica felt her palms begin to sweat as Michelle approached the counter. Behind her trailed a younger assistant clutching a leather portfolio. "Good morning," Michelle said, her voice warm but authoritative. Jessica cleared her throat. "Good morning, Mrs. Obama. How can I assist you today?" Michelle offered a small smile. "I need to make a transfer and access my safety deposit box." "Of course." Jessica's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then stopped. "May I see your ID, please?" Michelle reached into her purse and produced a passport and driver's license. Jessica took them carefully, glancing at the expiration dates. Both were current, but the system flashed a yellow alert. High-value transaction. Verification required. Jessica's stomach tightened. The new protocols required her to verify the information through an additional step, either a biometric scan or a phone call to the account holder's registered number. She glanced up at Michelle, who was scrolling through emails on her phone. "Mrs. Obama, I'm so sorry, but I need to verify your identity through an additional security step." Michelle looked up, surprised. "I just gave you my ID." "I understand, but it's part of the bank's new security measures." The assistant stepped forward, clearly irritated. "You know who she is, don't you?" Jessica's cheeks burned, but she stood her ground. "Yes, I do. But the system flagged the transaction and I'm required to follow protocol." Michelle's expression shifted. Not anger, but something sharper. Appraisal. "All right," she said, leaning back slightly. "Let's do the verification." Jessica exhaled, relieved, and began the process. She could feel eyes on her, the clients who had stopped pretending to mind their own business. She ignored them, focusing on the screen. A minute passed, then 2. The system lagged. The biometric match failed twice. "Is there a problem?" Michelle asked, her voice still calm but firmer now. Jessica glanced at her manager. Steve was already walking over, his face tight with irritation. "What's the holdup?" he demanded. Jessica explained quickly, but Steve barely listened. He looked at Michelle, then back at Jessica. "You need to resolve this immediately. We can't have scenes like this." Michelle's assistant spoke up. "This is ridiculous. You're treating her like a criminal." Steve gestured to the security guard near the entrance. "Escort Mrs. Obama to the private office while we sort this out." The tension in the room snapped. People murmured. Phones came out, cameras already recording. Jessica wanted to disappear. Michelle's voice cut through the noise. "I'll wait right here, thank you." Steve's face darkened, but he turned and walked away, leaving Jessica to face the growing storm, and as Jessica looked at Michelle, calm, poised but clearly annoyed, she had no idea that this moment would change her life forever. The tension in the bank thickened like fog as the murmurs of the onlookers swirled through the marble hall. Jessica Reed's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. The computer screen in front of her displayed the same frustrating error message. Transaction verification failed. Additional authorization required. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as if she could will the system to cooperate. Behind her, she could feel the weight of eyes, curious, judgmental, and impatient. Phones were pointed in her direction, their cameras capturing every uneasy breath and nervous glance. Michelle Obama stood on the other side of the counter, arms crossed and lips pressed together in a firm line. She was clearly trying to keep her composure, but her assistant wasn't as restrained. "This is insane," the assistant said, tapping her foot sharply against the marble. "You're telling me that the former First Lady of the United States needs to be verified like she's some random person off the street? Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds?" Jessica swallowed hard and looked up. "I'm really sorry for the inconvenience, but—" "But what?" the assistant snapped, cutting her off. "You're embarrassing her. For what? Following a bad policy?" Michelle raised a hand, silencing her assistant. "Let's not escalate this," she said softly, though her eyes locked on Jessica with a quiet intensity. "I understand you have procedures, but this is starting to feel less like security and more like something else." Jessica flinched. Something else. She knew exactly what Michelle meant. The words weren't spoken, but they didn't need to be. The doubt, the second-guessing, the subtle but constant reminders that people like Jessica, black women, had to work twice as hard to prove themselves. She'd felt it every day of her life. "I'm just doing my job," Jessica said, forcing her voice to remain steady. The assistant scoffed. "Your job? Your job is to serve clients, not humiliate them." Jessica felt the heat of humiliation rising to her cheeks. She turned towards the security guard stationed near the entrance, hoping for support, but he only gave her a wary glance, clearly waiting for instructions from the manager. Before Jessica could respond, Steve Mallory returned. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, and his tie looked slightly loosened, signs of the growing chaos he was struggling to manage. He didn't even glance at Jessica as he addressed Michelle directly. "Mrs. Obama, I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience," he began, his voice smooth but strained. "We're implementing new security protocols, and it appears there's been some miscommunication. If you'd like, I can personally escort you to a private room while we sort this out." "I'm fine right here," Michelle replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." The crowd rippled with murmurs of approval. A few heads nodded. Jessica caught snippets of whispers. "Why are they treating her like this? This would never happen to someone like me. It's because she's black. That's the only explanation." Jessica's stomach dropped. Steve's smile thinned. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Obama, but we do need to follow procedures." "Oh, now you're worried about procedures?" Michelle countered. "Where were these procedures when you called security, or when your employee was being publicly berated?" Jessica froze. Did she mean her? Michelle turned to the crowd, her voice carrying through the hall. "This isn't just about me. It's about the assumptions people make when they see someone who doesn't look like they belong. And don't pretend that isn't what's happening here." Jessica felt the weight of those words. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain that she had no choice, but her throat tightened. Steve's face reddened. "Mrs. Obama, I assure you that race has absolutely nothing to do with this situation." "Doesn't it?" Michelle's assistant snapped. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that." The murmurs in the crowd swelled. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording closer to Jessica's face. Jessica panicked. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keyboard, trying again to bypass the security block. But the system refused. "It's still locked," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Steve noticed. "What do you mean it's still locked?" "I can't override it. Not without authorization from compliance." Steve's eyes narrowed. "Then call them, now." Jessica reached for the phone, but her hand slipped. The receiver clattered against the counter, drawing another round of murmurs. She snatched it up and dialed, but the line rang endlessly. No answer. "This is unacceptable," Steve snapped, slamming his hand down on the counter. "Get compliance on the phone or I will—" "Enough." Michelle's voice cut through the noise, low but commanding. The room fell silent. Even the security guard shifted uncomfortably. "I don't need to be treated like a criminal," Michelle said, her eyes locked on Steve. "And I'm not going to be bullied into silence just because I followed the rules and came prepared with identification. If the problem is your system, then fix it. But don't you dare act like I'm the problem." The crowd erupted. "She's right," someone shouted. "This is discrimination, plain and simple," another voice added. Jessica flinched as the voices rose. Phones pointed at her, cameras flashed. People shouted over one another. Steve signaled to the security guards, "Clear this area, now." Jessica's stomach dropped as the guards moved toward Michelle. "No," Michelle said, stepping back but standing her ground. "I'm not leaving until this is resolved." The guards hesitated. No one wanted to be the person seen manhandling the former First Lady, but their presence only fueled the anger of the crowd. Jessica's vision blurred. She felt trapped between the protocol she was supposed to follow and the chaos spiraling out of control. "Mrs. Obama," she tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, let's just move to the back office and—" "No." Michelle's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Jessica. "I know you're just doing your job, but sometimes the job isn't enough." The words cut deep. Jessica wanted to scream that she wasn't the villain, that she had no choice. But the crowd didn't care about her story. They only saw what was in front of them, a black woman enforcing rules that humiliated another black woman. The door to the bank swung open and someone shouted, "He's here!" Jessica turned just in time to see a black SUV pull up outside. The crowd outside surged forward. Barack Obama stepped out, his face set in stone. Jessica's heart stopped. She was out of time. The doors to Whitman and Pierce swung shut behind Barack Obama, but the tension inside the bank only grew heavier. His presence, towering and calm yet commanding, brought a sudden hush to the marble-floored lobby. The sound of cameras clicking and phones buzzing filled the air like static electricity. Jessica Reed stood frozen behind the counter. Her eyes darted between Michelle Obama, who remained poised but visibly upset, and Barack, who strode toward his wife with long, deliberate steps. His suit jacket was unbuttoned and his tie slightly loosened, but there was no mistaking the authority radiating off of him. "Michelle," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room. She turned to him, her shoulders dropping slightly, as if the weight of the last 20 minutes had finally caught up with her. "They blocked the transaction," she said simply. Barack's eyes shifted to Steve Mallory, whose face had gone pale. "Blocked it?" Barack repeated, his voice sharp but controlled. "You're telling me this bank just stopped my wife from accessing her own money?" "It's not like that," Steve stammered. "We have protocols, new protocols, and we're just trying to follow them, Mr. President." "Former president," Barack corrected, his tone cold. Jessica flinched. She could feel Steve's growing panic and understood it too well. Barack Obama wasn't just a former president. He was a symbol, a figure who carried weight far beyond titles. And now he was standing in their lobby, staring Steve down like a hawk sizing up prey. "We just need authorization to complete the process," Jessica cut in, her voice trembling but desperate to regain control. Barack finally turned his attention to her. His gaze softened, but only slightly. "And you couldn't authorize this yourself?" "No, sir," Jessica said quickly. "The system flagged the transaction and only compliance can clear it. but compliance isn't answering their phones. Michelle shook her head. We've been standing here for nearly 20 minutes. Do you know how many people have been recording this? Barack's eyes darted to the crowd. Several clients had moved closer to the windows, broadcasting the scene on Instagram Live and TikTok. Through the glass, Jessica saw that the crowd outside the bank had doubled in size. Protesters with hastily made signs waved them above their heads. Justice for Michelle. Shame on Whitman and Pierce. Stop profiling black women. Reporters had gathered at the entrance, their cameras trained on the glass doors, waiting for the next development. Jessica's hands trembled. She knew this wasn't just about bank policy anymore. It wasn't even about Michelle Obama. It had become something bigger, a viral moment, a symbol of the racial and economic divides that continued to fester just beneath the surface of American society. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and nearly dropped it. Her notifications had exploded. "You're on Twitter," her coworker Bradley whispered, shoving his phone toward her. Jessica's heart sank. A video of her confrontation with Michelle was already trending. The caption read, "Bank teller harasses Michelle Obama. Racist discrimination or security overreach." She scrolled through the comments. "Fire her immediately. This is why we don't trust these institutions. She should be ashamed of herself. Poor Michelle. I can't believe this is happening to her." Jessica couldn't breathe. "Jessica," Steve barked, "focus." She flinched and turned back to the screen, but her vision blurred as anxiety clawed at her chest. Meanwhile, Barack was speaking, his voice measured but sharp. "You know, this isn't just about the inconvenience you've caused my wife," he said. "This is about respect. It's about the fact that you didn't think twice before calling security. It's about the fact that she had to defend herself while people filmed her like some kind of sideshow." "Mr. Obama," Steve began, but Barack cut him off with a raised hand. "No, you're going to listen," Barack said, "because this is exactly what we're talking about when we say systemic racism. It's not about someone shouting slurs or waving a Confederate flag. It's about moments like this. Moments when a black woman has to prove herself again and again, even when she's done everything right." The crowd erupted in applause. Jessica's throat tightened. She wanted to scream that she wasn't the enemy, that she understood racism better than most of the people in this room. But no one would listen. Not now. "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut through the commotion. Jessica turned to see a white man in his 60s step forward. He wore an expensive suit and an even more expensive watch, and his expression radiated disdain. "Let's not turn this into something it's not," he said loudly. "The girl was just doing her job. Maybe if Mrs. Obama had her affairs in order, we wouldn't be standing here." The room went silent. Barack turned toward the man, his expression unreadable. "And who are you?" "Someone who expects professionalism, not theatrics," the man said. "All this fuss over an ID check? Maybe we're too sensitive these days." Michelle's assistant started to speak, but Barack held up a hand. "You're part of the problem," he said to the man. "People like you think respect is optional, that it's something people like my wife and this young woman," he gestured toward Jessica, "have to earn, while you just assume it's yours." Jessica's eyes widened. Had he just defended her? The man scoffed and stalked out of the bank, but the damage had already been done. The room was buzzing again. "Sir," Steve interjected, his voice strained, "please, let us resolve this quietly." Barack shook his head. "Quietly? No. That's how things like this keep happening. Quietly." Jessica felt the weight of his words settle over her. She wasn't sure if he was condemning her or defending her, or maybe both. "Michelle," Barack said, turning back to his wife, "we're not leaving until this is fixed." Outside, the crowd swelled again as more reporters arrived. Jessica could hear them shouting into microphones. "Breaking news. Barack Obama has joined his wife inside the bank after allegations of racial profiling." The notifications on Jessica's phone kept coming. Her Instagram inbox was full of threats and insults. "Steve," she whispered, "I can't." "Not now," he snapped. But Jessica knew that not now wasn't an option anymore, not with the cameras rolling, not with the world watching. And as Barack Obama stepped closer to the counter, his eyes locked on hers, Jessica felt the walls closing in. The sound of the crowd outside the bank was deafening. Chants and shouts echoed off the glass windows, vibrating through the marble floors like distant thunder. Jessica Reed could feel the tension thickening with every passing second. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep her hands steady. Through the towering glass doors, she saw him, the unmistakable figure of Barack Obama stepping out of a sleek black SUV. The former president's presence sent ripples through the crowd. Phones shot into the air, capturing the moment. The protesters surged forward, pressing against the barricades hastily erected by security guards. Inside the bank, the air shifted. Customers and employees froze, their conversations dropping to whispers as Barack strode purposefully through the entrance. Jessica's throat tightened. She had seen him on television, in documentaries, and on campaign stages, but this was different. He wasn't delivering a speech or shaking hands with supporters. He was here because of a crisis that had started with her. Michelle turned as he entered, relief washing over her face for the first time since the confrontation began. She stepped toward him, her composure cracking just enough to reveal how shaken she was. "They won't release the transaction," she said quietly, but the anger beneath her calm exterior was clear. Barack's jaw tensed as he took her hand. "I saw the videos," he said, glancing around the room. His voice was low, but it carried across the lobby. "We're going to fix this." Jessica felt her stomach drop. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Steve Mallory, the branch manager, practically leapt forward to intercept the former president. "Mr. Obama, I want to personally apologize for the inconvenience caused to your wife. This is all just a misunderstanding." Barack raised a hand, silencing him. "No," he said firmly. "It's not a misunderstanding. It's a failure. A failure of judgment, a failure of policy, and a failure of respect." The crowd inside the bank erupted into murmurs. Phones were lifted, cameras zoomed in. Reporters outside pressed their microphones to the glass, desperate to catch his words. "Mr. Obama," Steve began again, his voice shaky, "if you just allow us to resolve this in private." "In private?" Barack cut him off, his voice sharper now. "So this can be swept under the rug? So no one sees what really happens to people who don't fit the mold of what a high-profile client is supposed to look like?" Michelle placed a hand on his arm. "Barack." He took a breath, calming himself, but his eyes remained locked on Steve. "Let me make something clear," Barack said. "This isn't just about Michelle. This is about every person who's ever walked into this bank and been treated like they don't belong." Jessica flinched at the words. They felt personal, even though she knew they weren't directed solely at her. "Sir," she said softly, trying to regain control, "I really am sorry, but I followed protocol. Barack turned to her. "I understand that you're doing your job," he said, his tone softening slightly. But sometimes policies are broken, not because they're wrong, but because they were built wrong to begin with. Jessica's lips parted, but no words came. He stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I know what it's like to be the one following orders, trying to stay in line because you can't afford to lose what you've worked for. But I also know the weight of being the person who has to make the hard choice to stand up when something isn't right. Tears burned in Jessica's eyes. She blinked them back, fighting to keep her composure. The assistant beside Michelle finally broke the moment. Mr. Obama, with all due respect, this isn't just about rules. It's about the way my boss was treated from the moment she walked in. Barack turned to her. You're absolutely right, he said. Then he faced the crowd, raising his voice. And that's why we're not going to let this slide. Michelle deserves respect. Every person in this bank deserves respect, no matter what they look like or how much money they have in their account. A cheer rose from the protesters outside, loud enough to shake the windows. Steve stepped forward again, desperation in his eyes. Please, Mr. Obama, we're doing everything we can to resolve this. We're calling compliance now. No, Barack's voice was sharp again. You're not doing everything you can, because if you were, this wouldn't have happened in the first place. Steve froze. I'll tell you what you're going to do, Barack continued. You're going to call the head of your compliance department, and while you're at it, you're going to call your CEO, because this is no longer just a customer service issue. This is national news. Jessica watched Steve fumble for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed. She knew what this meant. The fallout wasn't going to stop here. It was going to escalate. She glanced down at her own phone, still buzzing with notifications. Comments poured in. Fire her now. Justice for Michelle. This bank is done. Jessica wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them that she wasn't the villain, that she was just trying to protect her job, protect her family. But who would listen? As Steve spoke frantically into his phone, Michelle turned to Jessica. I'm not angry at you, she said quietly. Jessica blinked in surprise. You were put in an impossible position, Michelle continued. But you should never have to choose between doing your job and doing the right thing. Jessica's voice cracked. I didn't know what else to do. Barack stepped closer. You'll have to decide soon, he said, because this isn't over. Jessica swallowed hard. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of every camera lens pointed at her. Outside, the chants grew louder. Justice for Michelle. Fire the teller. Steve hung up his phone and turned back to Barack and Michelle, his face pale. The CEO's on his way, he said. He'll be here in 10 minutes. Barack nodded. Good. Then we'll wait. The cameras kept rolling. The crowd outside kept shouting. And Jessica stood there, trapped between her fear of losing everything and the dawning realization that nothing about this day would ever be normal again. Jessica Reed's legs felt weak as the room closed in around her. The weight of dozens of eyes, the hum of murmured conversations, and the steady chant of protesters outside the glass windows bore down on her like a physical force. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. Barack and Michelle Obama stood just a few feet away, but their presence felt even closer, suffocating in its intensity. They were calm, but their calmness only amplified Jessica's panic. She wanted to speak, wanted to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Michelle's assistant was pacing now, muttering into her phone while gesturing wildly toward the crowd outside. Steve Mallory, the branch manager, was glued to his own phone, whispering in frantic bursts as he tried to appease the bank's CEO. Jessica knew her name was probably being discussed in that conversation. Her job, her future, her livelihood hanging in the balance. It was Michelle who finally broke the silence. "Let's talk," she said, her voice softer than before but no less authoritative. "Not in front of everyone." Barack turned toward Steve. "Is there somewhere private where we can speak?" Steve nodded quickly and gestured toward a glass-walled office in the corner of the bank. "Of course. Please, right this way." Michelle turned to Jessica. "You too?" Jessica's stomach dropped. Her gaze darted toward Steve, silently pleading for an escape, but he was already ushering the Obamas toward the office. The security guard motioned for Jessica to follow. She wanted to refuse, to say she had work to do, but she knew better. Refusing wouldn't save her. It would only make things worse. Swallowing hard, she smoothed her blazer and walked toward the office, feeling as though she were heading to her own execution. The door clicked shut behind her. The hum of the crowd outside faded, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock and the faint vibration of her phone buzzing with notifications. Barack stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out at the growing mob of reporters and protesters. Michelle sat at the conference table, gesturing for Jessica to join her. "Sit down," Michelle said. It wasn't a request. Jessica hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, her knees practically buckling. She folded her hands in her lap, desperately trying to keep them from shaking. "Tell me," Michelle began, her eyes locked on Jessica's. "What happened?" Jessica blinked. "What?" "What happened?" Michelle repeated. "Not the rules, not the protocols. I want to know why you followed them so tightly, even when you saw what it was doing to me." Jessica's throat tightened. "I didn't have a choice." Barack turned from the window, his gaze heavy. "You always have a choice." "Not when I could lose my job?" Jessica's voice rose unexpectedly and she immediately regretted it. She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell, but it's true. I can't lose this job. I can't." Michelle's expression softened slightly. "Why?" Jessica hesitated. She hadn't wanted to explain herself, not like this, not in the middle of a scandal, but now it felt inevitable. "My brothers," she said quietly. "I take care of them." Michelle tilted her head. "How old are they?" "Terrence is 15. Miles is 9. Jessica swallowed. "Their asthma medication. It's expensive. Even with insurance, the copays are ridiculous." Michelle nodded, but it was Barack who spoke next. "What happened to your parents?" Jessica's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. "Not here. Not now." "They died," she said, 3 years ago. Car accident." The room fell silent. Barack exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the back of the chair. "And you've been supporting your brothers ever since?" Jessica nodded. "Yes, sir. That's why I couldn't risk breaking the rules. If I got fired, we'd lose everything." Michelle leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "So you were protecting them?" Jessica nodded again, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." Barack paced the length of the room. "And no one at this bank, none of your managers, ever thought to ask what might be going on behind the counter?" Jessica flinched. "No, sir," Michelle sighed. "I knew it." "Knew what?" Jessica asked, confused. "That this wasn't about you," Michelle said. "It was about the system, the policies that force people like you to be so afraid of losing what little security you have that you can't afford to stand up when something isn't right." Jessica stared at her, unsure how to respond. "You're not the problem," Michelle continued. "The system is." Barack nodded. But systems don't change unless people make them change. He looked at Jessica. And that's what you have to decide, whether you're willing to be the one who pushes for something better. Jessica shook her head. I can't risk it. You already have, Michelle said. Look outside. The cameras are rolling. The story is out there. You don't get to go back to being invisible after this. Jessica's pulse quickened. She wanted to protest, but Michelle's words rang true. There was no undoing what had happened. Barack pulled out his phone and began typing. What are you doing? Michelle asked. Fixing this, he replied. I'm calling our lawyers, and after that, I'm calling the CEO of this bank personally. Jessica's heart sank. What happens to me? Michelle met her eyes. That depends. Are you ready to fight for something bigger than this job? Jessica's lip trembled. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to be brave. But all she could think about were her brothers, their soccer cleats, their medication, their fragile stability. I don't know, she admitted. Barack set his phone down and stepped closer. Then let's figure it out together. Jessica looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. For the first time since the chaos began, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. But as the noise outside the office grew louder, she knew this wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning. Jessica Reed sat at the polished conference table, her pulse quickening as the noise outside the glass-walled office grew louder. Protesters chanted, their voices echoing even through the thick walls of the bank. Phones buzzed, cameras rolled, and the entire nation seemed to be watching. Barack Obama leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Michelle sat with her hands folded on the table, her sharp gaze never leaving Jessica's face. Jessica felt small beneath their attention. She wanted to sink into the chair and disappear, but there was no hiding now. Steve Mallory burst through the door, his face pale and glistening with sweat. The CEO is on his way up, he said, his voice trembling. 10 minutes. Barack didn't look up. Good. He's going to need to explain why his staff follows policies that humiliate women like my wife and terrify employees like Jessica. Steve winced and turned to Jessica. We need to resolve this before he gets here. I need you to release the transaction. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. But I can't, she said quietly, not without authorization. Steve's voice sharpened. Figure it out. Now. Before Jessica could respond, Michelle raised her hand, silencing them both. This isn't just about the transaction anymore, she said. It's about the bigger picture. Don't you see that? Steve blinked. What do you mean? Michelle leaned forward, her voice steady but forceful. This isn't the first time a black woman has been treated like she doesn't belong in a place like this. And it won't be the last unless something changes. Look outside. She gestured toward the crowd, visible through the window. Those people aren't just here for me. They're here because they've all been where I've been. Ignored, dismissed, humiliated, and they're tired of it. Barack stepped closer, his voice calm but pointed. You want to fix this quietly, he said to Steve. But that's not enough anymore. You can't just make this go away. You need to make it right. Steve swallowed hard. We're doing everything we can. No, Barack interrupted. You're doing everything you can to protect yourselves. What are you doing to protect her? He pointed at Jessica. Steve turned to Jessica, but she couldn't look at him. She was too busy trying to steady her breathing. Barack lowered his voice, addressing Jessica directly. You said you were afraid to lose your job. I get it. I do. But what if you didn't have to be afraid anymore? Jessica blinked. What do you mean? Michelle leaned in. You're stronger than you think, Jessica, and you're not alone. Not anymore." Before Jessica could process those words, the door to the office burst open again. The CEO of Whitman and Pierce strode in, flanked by 2 assistants and a lawyer. His silver hair and tailored suit screamed authority, but his tense expression betrayed his nerves. "Mr. Obama, Mrs. Obama." He nodded stiffly. "I'm deeply sorry for the events that transpired here today. I assure you this is not representative of our institution." Barack straightened. "Then fix it." "We're working on it," the CEO said quickly. He turned to Jessica. "Release the transaction immediately." Jessica's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "But the system?" "Override it," the CEO snapped. "Now." Jessica hesitated. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her. Michelle spoke gently. "Jessica, it's okay. Do it." Jessica exhaled shakily and typed the authorization code provided by the compliance team. The screen refreshed and the transfer cleared. "It's done," she said quietly. The CEO turned back to Barack and Michelle. "I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience. We will issue a formal apology, and I'll personally oversee a review of our security protocols." Barack nodded, but his expression remained serious. "I appreciate that," he said, "but this isn't just about apologies and protocols. It's about accountability, and it's about making sure this doesn't happen again. To anyone." The CEO flinched but nodded. "We'll do better." Michelle stepped forward, placing a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "And you'll take care of your employees," she said, "starting with Jessica." The CEO's eyes flicked to Jessica, clearly caught off guard. "Of course," he said quickly. "Jessica, we value your work here." Jessica looked up, her voice trembling. "Then why do I feel disposable?" The CEO paled. Barack stepped in again. "Because she is. And that's the real problem, isn't it?" Jessica felt her stomach twist. She didn't know whether to feel validated or terrified. The CEO stammered, "We'll address that." Michelle smiled softly. "Good, because if you don't, we will." The CEO swallowed hard, clearly unsure how to respond. Barack turned to Jessica. "You're not disposable, and today proved it." Jessica finally allowed herself to exhale. But before she could say anything, the lawyer interrupted. "We should move forward with damage control," the lawyer said. "We need to prepare statements." Barack shook his head. "No spin. The truth." Michelle added, "And the truth is that this bank needs to do more than apologize. It needs to change." The lawyer opened his mouth to argue, but the CEO stopped him with a look. "We'll make it right," he said. Barack turned back to Jessica. "And you?" Jessica swallowed. "I'll do what's right, too." The words left her lips before she fully understood them, but they felt true. Barack smiled. "Good, because this is just the beginning." Outside, the chants of the protesters shifted. The tone changed from anger to hope. Jessica glanced through the glass and saw signs that now read, "Accountability, not excuses. Justice for all." Jessica felt tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time that day, she didn't feel alone. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. Jessica Reed stepped out of the glass-walled office, her legs trembling beneath her. The conference room had felt like a pressure cooker, but outside, the bank lobby was no better. The crowd had only grown larger, and the chants of protesters vibrated through the marble floors, echoing off the walls. "Justice for Michelle. End discrimination now. Protect black women." Jessica's heart pounded as she made her way back to the counter, where Bradley, the junior teller, was nervously rearranging stacks of deposit slips. He looked up when he saw her, his eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the noise outside. Jessica wasn't sure how to answer. Her life had been upended in less than an hour. Her name was already trending on Twitter, her face plastered across social media feeds. And yet, somehow, she wasn't falling apart. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I will be." Before Bradley could respond, the door to the bank swung open and the CEO stepped out with Barack and Michelle Obama behind him. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the faint sound of camera shutters clicking. The CEO cleared his throat and addressed the crowd inside. "On behalf of Whitman and Pierce, I want to offer my deepest apologies to Mrs. Obama and to anyone who felt that today's events were a reflection of how we do business. They were not. But they did highlight areas where we need to improve, starting immediately." Jessica braced herself, waiting for him to throw her under the bus, to pin the entire scandal on her and make her the scapegoat. But he didn't. "We take responsibility for what happened here today," he continued. "And we are committed to addressing the underlying issues, both in our policies and in our culture." Jessica exhaled. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was more than she had expected. Barack stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "This isn't just about one incident," he said. "It's about a pattern, one that plays out in banks, in stores, in schools, and on streets all across this country. And it's about fixing that pattern so that people like Jessica," he glanced at her, "don't have to choose between following the rules and protecting their families." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. He had said her name, not as a villain or a scapegoat, but as someone worth protecting. Michelle stepped beside him. "This is about accountability," she said, "for the systems that fail us and the people who enforce those systems, often at their own expense." Jessica did what she thought she had to do. And that's exactly why we need to rethink the way we define doing the right thing. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jessica felt the tension in the room begin to shift. But before she could breathe a sigh of relief, a woman stepped forward from the line of customers. She was older, with silver hair and pearl earrings, and she looked furious. "I've banked here for 25 years, she said loudly, "and I'm closing my account today." The murmurs in the room turned uneasy again. "Me too," another man shouted. "I'll take my money somewhere that respects its customers." Panic gripped Jessica's chest. It didn't matter what the CEO or the Obamas said. People had already made up their minds. But Michelle stepped forward, her voice steady. "No one's asking you to excuse what happened today," she said. "But think about what change looks like. It doesn't come from running away. It comes from staying and demanding better from this bank and every other institution like it." The older woman hesitated, then nodded slowly before stepping back. Jessica couldn't believe what she was seeing. The crowd was calming, shifting from anger to something else, something like hope. Barack turned to Jessica. "You okay?" Jessica nodded, her voice trembling. "I think so." "You should be," Michelle said. "You stood your ground today." "I followed the rules," Jessica said. "No," Michelle corrected her. "You did more than that. You reminded us why the rules need to change." Tears welled in Jessica's eyes, but before she could respond, Barack spoke again. "I'll be working with the bank's leadership to make sure those changes happen," he said, addressing the room. "And Michelle and I will be contributing $500,000 to launch a new scholarship fund for young black women pursuing careers in finance." Applause broke out in the room. Even Jessica clapped, despite the lump in her throat. "And, Jessica," Michelle added, "you're going to help us design it." Jessica blinked. "Me?" Barack nodded. "Who better to make sure it works?" Jessica wanted to argue that she wasn't ready, that she didn't know the first thing about building scholarship programs. But then she thought of her brothers, Terrence and Miles, and the nights she had spent worrying about how to keep them safe. "I'll do it," she said. Michelle smiled. "I knew you would." As the crowd began to disperse and the chants outside faded, Jessica felt something she hadn't expected to feel when she woke up that morning: hope. Hope that she could make a difference. Hope that the system could change. And hope that maybe, just maybe, this day wouldn't be the worst of her life, but the start of something better. She looked through the glass doors at the protesters who were slowly lowering their signs, some even hugging each other in celebration. And for the first time all day, Jessica allowed herself to smile. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it wasn't hers to fight alone anymore. The bank lobby was quieter now. Most of the protesters had dispersed, leaving behind only a few stragglers and reporters who lingered in hopes of catching another comment from the Obamas. Inside, the once chaotic scene had settled into an uneasy calm. Employees bustled about, pretending to focus on their work, but their eyes constantly darted toward Jessica Reed, as if she had become both a cautionary tale and a symbol of defiance. Jessica sat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she organized the loose papers scattered across her counter. Her heart was still pounding, though less from fear and more from the overwhelming realization that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Michelle and Barack Obama stood near the front of the bank, speaking with the CEO and a team of executives who had hurried down from their offices after the scandal erupted. Jessica could see them gesturing, taking notes, and nodding along as Barack outlined reforms the bank needed to implement. Training programs, transparency policies, accountability measures, Barack said, his voice firm but measured. And not just for this branch, for every branch you operate. Michelle, standing beside him, added, "And I want quarterly reports showing exactly how these policies are being put into place. We're not just here for an apology. We're here for real change." Jessica couldn't hear the executives' responses, but their nods and furrowed brows told her they understood the gravity of the moment. She wasn't sure what scared her more, that the bank was about to undergo a massive transformation, or that she would somehow be a part of it. As the executives dispersed, Barack turned and approached Jessica's counter. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm better," she said. "Thank you." Michelle joined them, offering Jessica a reassuring smile. "You're braver than you realize." Jessica shook her head. "I wasn't brave. I was scared. I still am." "That's what makes you brave," Michelle said, "standing your ground even when it's hard." Jessica bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. "I didn't think anyone would see it that way." Barack leaned on the counter. "People already do. Look outside." Jessica glanced at the windows. The protesters were mostly gone, but a few remained, holding signs that now read, "Justice Won." Jessica stood tall. Change starts here. Tears welled in her eyes. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, just another girl trying to survive, trying to keep her family safe. And now the world knew her name. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted softly. Barack smiled. "That's the best part. You get to decide." Michelle stepped closer. "We're going to need your voice, Jessica, for the scholarship program, for the new training initiatives, for all of it." Jessica's stomach fluttered. But I don't know anything about that kind of work. You'll learn, Michelle said, and you won't be alone. We'll make sure of that. Jessica nodded, though her hands still trembled. Steve Mallory, the branch manager, approached nervously. Jessica tensed, expecting more criticism, but instead he extended his hand. I owe you an apology, he said. I let my fear of bad press get in the way of doing what was right. I should have supported you. Jessica hesitated, then shook his hand. I appreciate that, she said, and I'll make sure we're not just fixing this one incident, he added. We're already drafting new procedures to prevent this from happening again. Jessica nodded but remained wary. Words were easy. She'd learned that the hard way. It was action that mattered. Barack seemed to read her thoughts. We'll be watching, he said to Steve. Don't disappoint us. Steve's face paled and he quickly excused himself. As he walked away, Michelle turned back to Jessica. Now, for the most important question, she said, her smile widening. How are your brothers? Jessica's breath caught. She hadn't even thought about them since the chaos started. They're okay, she said. But I don't know how to explain all this to them. You tell them the truth, Michelle said, that their sister stood up for herself and for others, and that she's going to keep fighting to make things better. Jessica blinked back tears. Thank you. No, Michelle said. Thank you. Barack pulled out his phone. I already made a few calls. We're going to make sure your brothers have everything they need. Medical care, tutors, sports equipment, whatever it takes. Jessica's knees nearly buckled. You don't have to. We do, Barack interrupted, because no one gets through this life alone, and because you're going to do the same for others now. That's how this works. Jessica couldn't hold back the tears anymore. She wiped them away quickly, laughing nervously. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Michelle said. Just keep going. The cameras outside were still rolling as Barack and Michelle made their way toward the doors. Reporters shouted questions, flashes lit up the street, and the remaining protesters cheered. Jessica stood behind the counter, watching them leave, and felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she didn't feel like a background character in someone else's story. She felt like the author of her own. And as she turned back to her workstation, she knew she wasn't the same person who had started this day. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building something better. For herself, for her brothers, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. Outside, Michelle paused on the steps and turned back toward the glass windows. Her eyes found Jessica's, and she gave a small, knowing nod. Jessica straightened her shoulders. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Thanks for watching. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and share this video with your friends. Write in the comments what you think about this situation and where you're watching from. Check out our other videos as well. There's more to come.